Today on Brief History, we take a look at one of the most well-known and respected English kings in the history of the monarchy. His life would be a life of war, in his youth and as an adult, in England and abroad. He would win great glory on the battlefield and attain prestige on a level that few men could parallel. Join me as I take a brief look at Henry of Monmouth, remembered today as Henry V of England. Henry was born on September 16, 1386 at Monmouth Castle, from where his nickname would draw its origin. He was the son of Henry IV of England, known as Henry of Lancaster or Henry Bolingbroke, and his mother was Mary de Bohun. He was the eldest child of 6 legitimate children, which included his younger brothers, Thomas, who would eventually become the Duke of Clarence, John, who would eventually become the Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, who would eventually become the Duke of Gloucester. Being the eldest male child of Henry of Lancaster, he was in line to inherit the massive Duchy of Lancaster, one of the largest duchies in the kingdom. Henry spent the first 5 years of his life with his mother, but moved between his maternal and paternal grandparents' houses as he grew. He began his formal education around 8 years old, and it is believed that he took a keen interest in learning, as his father did. It was also believed that Henry was aware, even in his youth, of the stressed relations between France and England, something that would become a major aspect in Henry's life as he became an adult, and something that will be discussed in much more detail shortly. Much of Henry's childhood saw the battles between the then King of England, Richard II, and the leading men of the realm, which included his father and grandfather, Henry of Lancaster and John of Gaunt. Henry's father was first cousins with King Richard II, and they had a contentious relationship throughout their childhood, which would spill over into their adult lives. Henry's father became opposed to Richard II, who began to rule tyrannically and foolishly. Eventually, Henry's father was banished to the continent for 10 years, and during this time, Henry's grandfather died, to which Richard took the incredible step of banishing Henry's father for life and seizing his massive Lancastrian inheritance. This was unacceptable to many in England, and Henry's father rallied support and returned to England to contest Richard. Richard traveled to Ireland and took Henry as a quasi-hostage with him. However, it is said that Henry, around 12 years old at this time, was treated very well by Richard, who gave him money, armor, equipment, and even went as far as knighting Henry while in Ireland. This good treatment will come up again later in Henry's story. However, once Richard learned of Henry's father's landing in England to contest his decision and ultimately his kingship, he imprisoned Henry in Trim Castle in Ireland. Richard, after returning to England, was no match for Henry's father, who quickly captured him as he was unable to gain support due to his poor behavior as king. After Richard's capture, Henry's father ordered that Henry be released and brought back to England. Richard was eventually deposed, and Henry's father became King Henry IV after being confirmed by the nobles of the realm. Henry was present at his father's coronation and was declared as Prince of Wales 2 days later. He would also be granted a vast amount of other titles around this time, including becoming the Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, and Duke of Aquitaine. He also took over his father's title, Duke of Lancaster, as his father decided he would not hold this title while he was king. It should be noted, however, that almost all of the income from these lands would be controlled by his father and others, and Henry would not play a major role in their governance. Unfortunately, many saw Henry's father as a usurper, and rebellion arose almost immediately in opposition to Henry's father's kingship. This led to Henry's father allegedly starving Richard to death at Pontefract Castle, which would become a source of contention in itself during his time as king. Henry, although young, was expected to play a role in these disputes, and as we will see, this exposure to constant military struggle in his youth would influence his behavior as he continued to grow into a man. In September 1400, a Welsh rebel known as Owain Glyndwr started a rebellion against Henry's father and declared himself as Prince of Wales, a title that had already been bestowed to Henry, as stated previously. Henry's father was returning from a failed Scottish campaign and headed to confront the rebellion with Henry joining him. Although he went along on the campaign, he played no active role in the attempted suppression of it, as it was deemed too risky for a young prince to partake in such activities. He was sent to Chester, where he was given power to pardon rebels who requested to be pardoned. Here he spent extended periods of time with a man named Sir Henry Percy, nicknamed Hotspur. Hotspur, along with others, became military mentors to Henry, who would eventually travel back to Wales after the failed first attempt by his father, and continue to learn about warfare in Wales. At the age of 16, Henry was formally made a royal deputy in Wales and given an army, but he quickly ran into financial issues, something that his father struggled with greatly in his time as king. He pawned his smaller jewels in order to pay his men and was able to make ends meet, but eventually even greater problems would arise in Wales. In 1403, Hotspur, along with many of Henry's close mentors and companions in Wales, turned against his father and ultimately him. Hotspur became friendly with the Welsh rebel Owain Glendower and desired to capture Henry and march on his father's forces. Henry's father, upon hearing of this news, set out to meet up with Henry with the intention of bringing Hotspur to battle after they rendezvoused. He sent men ahead to capture Shrewsbury, cutting off Hotspur's advance and trapping him. Henry was able to meet up with his father, and together they assaulted Hotspur's forces in what was to become known as the Battle of Shrewsbury. Henry fought in the thick of the battle and was wounded by an arrow to the face, but refused to leave the battlefield. Hotspur's forces would eventually be defeated, and Hotspur himself would be killed, after which Henry was transported to Kenilworth Castle in order to undergo a medical procedure to remove the arrow from his face. It is believed that this would have left Henry scarred, but there are no contemporary descriptions that notate this. Although Hotspur had been defeated, Owain Glendower continued to gain strength and was bolstered by support in France. As stated before, England and France had had a difficult relationship through Henry's youth, and although truces had been agreed to over the years, the reality is that the two had been at war with each other for over 68 years. This war started in Henry's great-grandfather Edward III's time and is known today as the 100 Years' War. Henry's great-grandfather and his supporters had great successes early in the war, winning great victories at Crécy and Poitiers, and was able to greatly increase the amount of territory controlled in France via the Treaty of Bretigny. Unfortunately, the lands that were to be gained in this treaty would end up being lost at the end of Henry's great-grandfather's reign, but remained in the minds of many. It is also important to note that Henry's great-grandfather had a passable claim to the French throne and had defiantly declared himself as King of France, something that would be continued by his successors. Richard II had not pursued war to the degree which was expected after Edward III's death. Now, Henry's father as king, although interested in pursuing the conflict, found it difficult to do so as he battled bad financial situations and constant rebellion. A major incident took place in France around this time. The then King of France, Charles VI, had had multiple bouts of madness and was unable to rule the kingdom in his own right. His younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, gained powerful influence in the regency that was formed for the sick king. This was contested by a rival faction and its leader, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. On November 20th, 1407, Louis, Duke of Orleans, was assassinated on the orders of John the Fearless. This sent France into a civil conflict between two factions, the Burgundians, who supported John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, and what was to become known as the Armagnacs, who were supporters of the murdered Louis, Duke of Orleans. The name Armagnac derives from Louis's son and heir, Charles' wife's family, the House of Armagnac. The internal conflict within France would become a major aspect of Henry's future, as we will soon see. Henry had been made lieutenant for all of Wales in 1406, after his father was forced to deal with other issues in the kingdom. Although Henry was heavily involved in Wales, his father still maintained a tight grip on control. However, Henry's father's health began to decline, and it was believed that Henry would soon become king, an idea that was actually preferred by many in Parliament, especially the Commons, who had battled with Henry's father throughout his time as king. Henry, in contrast to his father, was open-minded, willing to listen to counsel, and even change his mind upon receiving counsel, and this is something that many desired sooner than later. Henry's father by that time also had begun to show signs that he preferred Henry's younger brother, Thomas, to him, something that would bring tension between the two brothers, with Henry actually convincing many to remove Thomas from positions of power in his jealousy. Henry's influence began to grow, as did his importance politically, as he had become part of the council in the wake of his father's decline. He became more critical of his father's actions as time passed, and it was clear that Henry was becoming impatient while waiting for his father to pass away. By 1410, Henry had become less involved in the Welsh troubles and spent most of his time in London, believing he was soon to ascend to the throne. He was given custody of Edmund Mortimer at this time. Edmund Mortimer was a claimant to the throne of England, and he had been in Henry's father's captivity after his seizure of the throne, as Edmund potentially had a better claim to the throne due to the fact that he was the male heir to Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt's older brother. Edmund will be discussed later in Henry's story. To the annoyance of Henry, his father began to improve and started to become involved in royal business again, and it was becoming clear that Henry would have to wait longer than he had desired. He began to dominate the council, forcing many of his father's supporters out and replacing them with his own friends. He and his friends continued to increase their influence and began doing unorthodox things, like meeting in odd places such as their own homes. At that time in 1410, John the Fearless had control of Charles VI and the royal French government, and Henry saw a chance to try and form an alliance to gain back English lands that had been won in France, then subsequently lost by his great-grandfather, as discussed previously. Naively, Henry agreed to help the Burgundians in exchange for these lands, and sent troops in 1411 to assist in their struggles. But the agreement was vague, and nothing substantial was gained in return. Henry and the council also began to prod his father to abdicate, as Henry's desire to become king was ever growing. But his father was strong-willed and had worked hard to attain and maintain his kingship. He had had enough of his son's attempts to take his power and remove him from his throne. Therefore, in November 1411, Henry's father, in a state of invalidity, sacked the prince and all his allied counselors, annulled all the limits that had been placed on his power, and reinstated his close allies to the council. Henry could do nothing now but wait. To add further stress to the situation, Henry's father began plans to support the Armagnacs in France. Due to the fact that Henry had had friendly relations with the Armagnac's rival faction, the Burgundians, previously, his father deemed it would not be proper to appoint Henry as the leader of the army to be sent to the continent to assist the Armagnacs. His younger brother and quasi-rival, Thomas, was appointed instead, something which unsurprisingly infuriated Henry. This would be the low point of Henry's relationship with his father and brother. Rumors began to fly that Henry planned to usurp power from his father, and although he publicly denied these allegations, they nevertheless persisted. Eventually, Henry had had enough of the problems with his father. He traveled to London and met with his father, falling to his knees and offering a dagger so that his father might slay him, as he would rather be dead than be seen as an enemy. The two were reconciled, and no further animosity was held between father and son. On March 20th, 1413, Henry's father died, and with that came the next chapter in the 26-year-old Henry's life. Henry, over the centuries, has been portrayed in his youth as a boisterous, unruly, even at times criminal figure before he became king. These are largely inventions of the 16th century, with William Shakespeare being among those adopting that particular narrative. Although his youthful activity seems to have been greatly exaggerated, it is believed that Henry in his youth did make it a point to enjoy himself, and there are multiple contemporary accounts that add to the notion that at the very least he was an impatient young man who engaged in and enjoyed youthful activities. Further credit is given to this notion in that major changes came about when he became king. Henry was crowned as King Henry V of England on April 9, 1413, in a snowstorm at Westminster Abbey. It is said that upon his ascension to king, his demeanor and personality changed almost instantaneously. It is believed that Henry took his role as king very seriously, and whatever perhaps questionable activities he partook in prior to becoming king was no longer acceptable in his new role. Henry had a lot to prove, and succession could be a tumultuous experience, especially if you were descended from a man who could have been considered a usurper. He had not accomplished anything of great military importance at this time, and his contentious and impatient relationship with his father did not help the way he could be perceived. And so, Henry was keen to set the record straight on who exactly he would be as King of England. Religion and religious devotion became paramount. As an anointed king chosen by God, he fully believed that his actions were divinely guided by God's hand, and any success he may attain was due to this, nothing else. He swore off sexual promiscuity, removed many of his friends that were now no longer acceptable, and he began to show his younger brother Thomas great respect and honor. Henry previously had had friends who were sympathetic to those who contested the church and its teachings at the time. Henry had in his youth not been openly opposed to these men and their ideals, but now, after dedicating himself to faith, no longer permitted such heretical ideas. Henry's father had buried Richard II at Langley, against the wishes of the deposed king, who had wished to be buried next to his wife in a tomb he commissioned in Westminster Abbey. In the first weeks of Henry's reign, he reinterred Richard where he had requested to be laid, many believe due to Richard's kind treatment of him in his youth. He also released the now 22-year-old Edmund Mortimer, a rival claimant to the throne of England discussed previously, and had his inheritance delivered to him. Crime was an issue that was growing in England, and Henry took this issue head on. He was involved in laws being passed against rioters, murders, and other criminal activity, and sent his men out to the Welsh border to conduct special sessions, as the crime was worst in those areas. All these things built trust in Henry as a king, and this would greatly benefit him, especially in Parliament, where the Commons, who in the past were so reluctant to help his father, would grant him many taxes. In 1412, the Armagnacs and Burgundians made peace with each other and united against England just prior to Henry's father's death. This put an end to the expedition that was started by Henry's father, in which Henry's younger brother Thomas was sent as the leader of an army, as discussed previously. Forces remained on the continent, but with the French united, Henry renewed the truce with France. The French saw Henry as a new and inexperienced ruler and military leader and treated him as such. But the factional disagreements in France would soon again come to the surface, with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, being forced to flee from Paris. The Armagnacs took control of the royal government, and this time full-blown civil war erupted, with both factions attempting to seek an alliance with Henry. Both sides offered marriage, but with the Armagnacs in control of the mentally ill King Charles VI, they were able to discuss a potential marriage to Charles's 13-year-old daughter, Catherine of Valois, of which Henry was very interested in pursuing. However, Henry was well aware of the agreements in which both the Burgundians and the Armagnacs failed to hold up their ends of the bargain with him and his father respectively. In the fall of 1414, Henry pushed for significant French concessions if the Armagnacs wished to secure an alliance. Henry agreed he would drop his claim to the French throne if the terms of the Treaty of Bretigny from the reign of Edward III discussed previously was implemented. This would include the English taking control of all of Aquitaine and Poitou and collecting an outstanding ransom that had not been paid when the King of France was captured by the English in Edward III's reign. Additionally, it was requested that Catherine's dowry be particularly high, and Henry wished to have direct control of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, with overlordship to Brittany and Flanders. Perhaps Henry was truly looking to easily extract as much as he could from his strong position, or perhaps he was looking to make terms so outrageous that the French would have to decline and he could then declare war. Whatever the case, the French unsurprisingly declined, and Henry summoned Parliament to raise funds for a campaign in France, while the divisions remained strong between the factions. The Commons had been happy with Henry's actions early in his reign, and so were open to granting a tax for his expedition, which was done. Henry was also promised financial support from the clergy, but in February 1415, the Burgundians and Armagnacs again attempted to reconcile. After reaching terms, the French factions denied all the English demands put forward. It is believed that around this time, the infamous tennis ball incident occurred. The heir to the French throne, known as the Dauphin, Louis, allegedly wrote to Henry with aggressive and threatening words and gave a gift of tennis balls to Henry, implying that Henry was but a child who still took interest in such things. It is believed that Henry sent a strong-worded reply, insisting that he would put the French to flight from their own kingdom. but the French clearly had no respect for Henry as king or military leader. With this, war was all but inevitable, and a campaign was on the horizon. Although Henry was granted taxes and loans, he wished to take part in a 12-month campaign and did not have money to pay for what was expected in advance. Henry decided to give royal jewels as collateral, which would force Henry to come up with money in order to retake the items back once the campaign was completed. Processes were set in motion to make proper provisions for the defense of the realm in other sectors, including Scotland, Wales, and Calais. At this point, a revolt emerged against Henry, known as the Southampton Plot. The plot was led by 3 men, which included a cousin of Henry's father, Richard of Conisbrough, brother of Edward, Duke of York, who was heavily involved in Henry's father and Richard II's reign. Exactly what the plot intended isn't fully understood, but a widely accepted explanation put forth is that the conspirators intended to replace Henry with the released Edmund Mortimer, who, as discussed previously, had a claim to the English throne. This was concerning, in that the men involved were very close to Henry, especially Richard of Conisbrough, who had been recently elevated to an earldom. Edmund Mortimer was actually the one who alerted Henry to the plot and was not punished for any implied involvement. Richard of Conisbrough and the others involved were executed, and Henry went on with his campaign preparations. It is interesting to pause here and note that Richard of Conisbrough was from the House of York and was married to Edmund Mortimer's sister, Anne. This couple would be grandparents to 2 future famous kings of England. Henry set sail for France in 1415 with an army of approximately 12,000 men. This was the first time a king of England had led an army to France since Henry's great-grandfather Edward III had done so, and the size of Henry's army was similar in strength to that of Edward III's. It is believed that Henry was expecting to take part in attrition-style siege warfare, rather than the fast raiding-style warfare implemented by his great-grandfather. Henry intended to seize territory and keep a hold of it, something that would yield great financial benefits, which he surely needed. Normandy was first in his sights, as the duchy could provide significant financial benefit and would allow Henry to remove potential threats to English ships in the Channel. Normandy could also be easily resupplied from England, and the Normans themselves had long been suspicious of the French monarchy in Paris. In August 1415, Henry and his army laid siege to Harfleur, with the French not being able to raise an army to bring Henry to battle. The siege unexpectedly lasted 5 weeks, to which Henry's army was reduced by sickness. In addition, Henry wished that Harfleur would become an English stronghold on the continent, such as that of Calais, and so implanted a permanent garrison there, which also depleted his forces further. With so many men eliminated from his army, Henry decided against pushing further into France and wished to withdraw to Calais. It is believed that around this time he summoned the Dauphin, who had previously insulted him with the tennis ball gift, to personal combat. The winner of the duel was to succeed Charles VI as the King of France, but no response was given. Henry headed towards Calais, not intending to encounter the French in combat. However, Henry was unaware that the French had gathered an army, which now blocked his route to Calais. Henry, needing to cross the Somme River, headed east, deeper into French territory, and was able to find an unguarded crossing to which he could safely move his army across the river. He again moved towards Calais, hoping to avoid battle with the French. However, the French were able to move to intercept Henry before he reached the city, and made contact with him near the village of Agincourt on October 24, 1415. Henry believed that a battle would take place that day and moved his army into formation, but the French delayed a battle in order to perhaps allow further men to gather to their banners. The size of both armies has been greatly disputed over the centuries, but what is certain is that the French army size was significantly larger than Henry's English army. However, the English army was led by their king, Henry. The French, on the other hand, did not have their king, or even the Dauphin, to lead the French forces in battle. The armies retreated to their camps for the night, after it became clear that a battle would not be given on that day. During the night, a rain soaked the battlefield, and on the morning of October 25, 1415, both sides fell into formation. The subsequent battle that would take place would become known as the Battle of Agincourt. This battle would go down in history as one of the most famous military victories for the English in all the 100 Years' War. Henry initially advanced to attempt to lure the French into action. This plan worked, and the French sent in their cavalry to destroy the English archers, who had been set up on the flanks and in front of the men-at-arms. Henry, however, had wooden stakes implanted for the archers' defense, and the cavalry charge would prove unsuccessful. The attacking French cavalry would be forced to retreat into oncoming French foot soldiers, who were by that time advancing towards the English position. The French advance was slowed by the wet, freshly planted ground, and Henry's placement of and defense of his archers made for devastating effects. The French were funneled into a position where their greater numbers did not benefit them, and slowly, under the constant barrage of English arrows, they began to waver, with the battle swinging into Henry's favor. Henry was said to have gloriously taken part in battle, an obviously dangerous task. Edward, Duke of York, discussed previously, was killed in this battle, one of the most prominent English nobles to fall at Agincourt. Eventually, the remaining French divisions, seeing the battle was lost, began to flee the field. Henry realized victory and ordered his army to search the battlefield for prisoners for ransom. But at this time, an alert was incorrectly spread that the French were launching another attack. Henry, fearing he was out of position, ordered prisoners to be killed in order to regroup his forces. In a modern context, this would seem unacceptable, but Henry was put in such a situation that decisive decision-making was an absolute necessity for victory and for the preservation of his forces and the victory as a whole. The threat of a French attack was still very possible at this time, and so many view Henry's actions as acceptable in the context to which the executions took place. This victory gave Henry a degree of prestige and proved to many that he was capable as a military leader. But it did not end the war, nor did it give Henry complete military supremacy in France. The following day, he moved to Calais and then to London, where he was welcomed with great honor and celebration. The victory at Agincourt was important, as it allowed Henry to gain foreign allies, continue to raise taxes and loans, and continue to build for Henry a positive reputation within the realm. But as stated previously, the French were still very capable of continuing to fight. In January 1416, Henry began to plan another expedition to France, and around this time, the French moved against the garrison at Harfleur, blockading the port and surrounding the city. Henry was forced to send a relief force to the continent under the command of his younger brother, John, Duke of Bedford, who would defeat the French at the Battle of the Seine and relieve the battered city. Henry continued raising money and forces, settling debts and gaining support. The new campaign would be different this time. The Normans were distant from the French king and his court in Paris, as stated before, and had historically maintained a degree of autonomy. In fact, prior to the disastrous reign of King John of England, Normandy for many years had been held by the King of England. Henry intended to amplify these feelings and wished to reassert English control over the duchy in its entirety. He appealed to the Normans, king on the past that England and Normandy shared together. On August 1st, 1417, Henry's second campaign in France began, with his forces landing in Normandy and taking the city of Caen in 2 weeks. The French, still plagued by quarrels amongst themselves, were not able to muster an army to confront Henry. By 1418, Henry had captured Falaise and divided parts of his army between his brothers Thomas, Duke of Clarence, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, to capture further territory on their own. Normandy at that time was split into 2 regions, Lower and Upper Normandy. By July, Henry had taken control of Lower Normandy and began a siege of Rouen in Upper Normandy. The siege of Rouen was a difficult one and lasted 6 months, and when the city finally surrendered, the rest of Upper Normandy fell quickly with it. With this, all of Normandy was under Henry's control, with the exception of Mont Saint-Michel, which never surrendered. Henry quickly began implementing his plans for governance of the region. Caen became the administrative capital, and he appointed Englishmen to sheriff-type positions, but allowed Normans to occupy many of the lower-ranking positions in these hierarchies. He stressed and enforced good relations between his soldiers and the Norman population, and opened up avenues for civilians to address complaints. The plan worked well, and Henry was able to continue to exert his control over the duchy. The French had remained quasi-united against the English, but in the wake of Henry's success in Normandy, things were about to drastically change. In the summer of 1418, both sides of the French conflict contacted Henry. Power had shifted in Paris yet again when John the Fearless of Burgundy retook control of the king and the royal government. The Dauphin Louis had died a few months after the Battle of Agincourt, and his younger brother Charles eventually became the new Dauphin. He and his Armagnac supporters were forced to flee south. These continued French divisions benefited Henry, and he knew it, and so began to negotiate with both in an effort to continue to sow the seeds of discontent. He negotiated with the Dauphin first, then the Burgundians, of which neither negotiations were able to yield any results immediately. However, the Burgundians, now in control of the government, eventually stated that they were prepared to agree to many of Henry's demands, which included granting the lands of the Treaty of Bretigny, as well as Normandy, and Henry's large dowry demands in relation to Catherine of Valois. In May and June of 1419, Henry met with the Burgundians at Moulins to hammer this out. But John the Fearless was attempting to double-cross Henry, and although he was present in Moulins for part of the time, he was simultaneously negotiating with the Dauphin in Paris. In July, the two fighting French factions agreed to work together against Henry and the English once again. Once Henry learned of this, he moved towards Paris, reaching the edge of the city in August. He contemplated laying siege, something that would have been a very difficult task to accomplish. But another major incident took place in September 1419, which would change the course of history between the two kingdoms and benefit Henry in a very significant way. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was set to meet the Dauphin Charles on a bridge in the town of Monstrelet to discuss further their alliance against Henry. While on the bridge, John the Fearless was assassinated by one of the Dauphin's supporters in retaliation for the killing of the Duke of Orleans years prior. This ended any chances that the French factions could unite against Henry, and with this, Henry was now in the strongest position he had ever been while in France. The assassination of John the Fearless forced the Burgundians to ally with Henry, and the Burgundian-controlled royal council contacted Henry for a truce. John the Fearless's son, Philip the Good, now Duke of Burgundy, was intent on planning revenge for the death of his father. Henry and his ambassadors, in addition to the demands requested previously, pushed for the French to recognize Henry's claim to the French throne. Although the French council was surprised at this request, they were in no position to deny Henry's demands. The terms were agreed to, and the treaty, which would become known as the Treaty of Troyes, was signed on May 21, 1420, in the Cathedral of Troyes. This meant that Charles VI was formally acknowledging Henry as the heir to the French throne, and although Charles VI would remain king for life, the throne would henceforth pass to Henry and then subsequently to Henry's heirs. The throne of England and France was to be held by one person moving forward, although the normal customs of each realm were to be recognized and maintained. Henry was betrothed to Catherine of Valois on the same day the treaty was recognized, and the Dauphin was effectively disinherited, although not formally until December 1420, at which point he was also declared an outlaw. Charles remained king, but Henry nevertheless would take over control immediately, with his marriage to Catherine taking place 2 weeks after the agreement was reached. Although the sequence of events that had taken place were astounding, it did not end the war, as the Dauphin and the Armagnac faction continued to fight. Henry recovered Monstrelet and John the Fearless's body, and then laid siege to and captured Moulins. Henry implemented reforms in his new role in France, which addressed many problematic issues and saw to correcting some. This proper rule was welcomed by many who had seen nothing but civil conflict under the control of the mentally ill Charles VI. Unfortunately, with the successes that Henry attained in France, his attention was almost wholly directed at the administration of his French interests, yet he still preferred that English issues be referred to him before any decisions were made. Soon some back in England were calling for the king to return after he had been away for 3 years on the continent. Henry obliged, and he and his wife Catherine landed back in England in February 1421. 10 months later, their first child, a boy who would be named Henry, would be born. The future seemed bright for Henry and his dynasty, but soon Henry's fortune would change, and the effects would be felt for years to come. While in England, Henry received news that his brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, had been killed in the Battle of Bougie in Anjou on the continent. Henry raised money through loans, but did not request a tax from Parliament at this time. He then set out for France in June 1421, landing at Calais with an army. Henry moved south and assisted Philip the Good in his siege of Chartres, but the Dauphin retreated his forces before Henry was able to arrive. He then turned his attention to the town of Meaux, which was near Paris and held by the Dauphin. The town was well fortified, and the siege took significantly longer than expected, lasting 7 months. Henry, enraged by the resistance, executed many from the town and the surrounding area. Although the future seemed bright for Henry, having by that time a new baby son to which it would be expected would carry on his dynastic ambitions, by May 1422, Henry's health began to deteriorate, and he showed signs of a severe intestinal sickness. Although clearly sick, Henry refused to rest and continued to push himself. He attempted to reassure those around him that he would be fine, but many could see the writing on the wall, and in August 1422, Henry traveled to the castle of Vincennes. By that time, reality had hit Henry, and he was aware of his impending demise, yet he continued to attempt to deal with his royal business. In August, he adjusted his will to designate his younger brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of his 8-month-old son, although Humphrey's exact role was vague, and this would cause problems in young Henry's subsequent reign. It is alleged that as he lay dying, he urged for the continuation of the war, and that Normandy should remain in English hands at all costs. Shortly thereafter, on August 31st, 1422, at 35 years of age, King Henry V of England died from his illness. He was embalmed, with his body being taken to Calais for the voyage back to England. It was said that many in France mourned the death of Henry due to the fact that a certain degree of stability had been recovered from the civil struggles between the Burgundians and Armagnacs. His body landed at Dover in October and was taken to London, where he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey on November 7, 1422, close to the shrine of Edward the Confessor at a spot he had designated years prior. A wooden effigy adorned the tomb, but the head, hands, and silver plating of the robes were robbed in the subsequent centuries. In the 1970s, the head and hands were replaced, and this tomb and tomb effigy can be seen at Westminster Abbey to this day. Henry's time as king requires very little in the form of commentary. He is probably considered one of the most famous kings of England, and his personality and successes have been well documented, remembered, and exaggerated over the centuries. His life was a life of war, from his youth fighting in Wales on his father's behalf to his campaigns on the continent. Military experiences dominated the political landscape of his time. He was able to achieve glory on a level that others could only dream, and his successes rivaled those of his much-loved great-grandfather, with his victory at Agincourt being one of the most remembered events in all of the 100 Years' War. Unfortunately, although we certainly cannot criticize Henry for his early demise, his death would leave a gaping hole in England and France that would not be able to be filled by his 9-month-old son or the leading men who surrounded him. His son's subsequent reign would see one of the bloodiest civil conflicts that England has ever seen, and it would eventually culminate in the vicious destruction of his dynasty as a whole. Henry's early and unexpected death would certainly lead to future problems, but although unfortunate, it may have cemented his popular position in the minds of many, for Henry had little time to make mistakes that could have tarnished his reputation should he have survived longer. Many kings found great successes early in their reigns, only to subsequently make mistakes, encounter rebellion, and experience detestation from their people and allies. Seizing control of power in that time was no doubt a difficult task, and something that Henry was successful at. But the maintenance of power many times was a far less glorious endeavor, and many a king and queen found that maintaining control was extremely difficult, if not impossible. What the future of Henry's reign would have looked like, should he have survived to old age, we will never know. But if his successes, personality, and administration early in life were any indication on who he would have been later in his reign, perhaps there is a good possibility that we would still be singing the praises of a glorious and accomplished English monarch.